Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of the evening where stories unfold like mist across cobblestones, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where the gaslit streets of Victorian London await your peaceful exploration. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight, to this space crafted especially for you, designed to ease the weight of the day from your shoulders and guide your thoughts toward the gentle realm of sleep. Perhaps you have had a long day. Perhaps your mind has been racing with tomorrow's concerns. Or perhaps you simply seek the comfort of a story told in the darkness. Whatever brings you here, you are welcome, you are safe, and you are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we journey together into the fog-wrapped streets of 1894 London, where gas lamps cast their amber glow upon wet pavements, where hansom cabs clatter past on their endless rounds, and where at 221 B. Baker Street, a particular detective sits by his fire, pipe smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. This is a mystery, yes, but one designed not to startle or alarm, but rather to carry you gently through its twists and turns, like a boat upon a calm river, drifting peacefully towards the shores of sleep. There will be no violence here, no harsh words or sudden frights, only the quiet satisfaction of puzzles solved, of truth illuminated, of justice served with the gentle inevitability of dawn following night. So now, settle yourself into whatever comfortable space you have claimed this evening. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket close, allow your body to sink deeper into softness. Take a slow breath with me, in through the nose, filling the lungs completely, and out through the mouth, releasing every bit of tension. Again, breathing in peace, breathing out worry, and once more, letting your shoulders drop, your jaw relax, your entire being soften into this moment. We begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 days without cease. That peculiar autumn rain which transforms the great city into a watercolour painting. All edges softened, all sounds muffled by the steady whisper of water upon stone. Within the sitting room at Baker Street, the fire burned with exceptional vigour, Mrs. Hudson having supplied an abundance of coal against the dampness that crept through even the stoutest walls. Sherlock Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair, the Morocco leather creaking softly beneath him as he shifted position, his long fingers steepled before his aquiline nose, grey eyes fixed upon the dancing flames with that particular intensity which suggested his mind wandered through labyrinths far removed from the cosy confines of his rooms. I sat across from him, the evening newspaper spread upon my lap, though I had read the same paragraph thrice without absorbing a single word, my attention drawn instead to the symphony of small sounds that filled our sanctuary, the soft sputtering of the fire, the rhythmic ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece, the gentle patter of rain against the windows, and beneath it all, the distant rumble of London's ceaseless life, carriages passing below, a street vendor's faint call, the mysterious groaning of old buildings settling into the night. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of evenings spent in companionable silence with the one friend whose presence required nothing of me but acceptance. "Watson," Holmes murmured at last, his voice emerging from his reverie like smoke from his pipe. "Do you believe in goblins?" The question was so unexpected, so perfectly absurd given the rational man who posed it, that I could not help but smile. "I confess," I replied, matching his contemplative tone, "that my medical training did not include a thorough study of folklore creatures, Might I inquire what prompts such philosophical speculation on this rainy evening? Holmes reached beside his chair and withdrew a folded newspaper, not the respectable Times which lay upon my own lap, but rather one of the penny dreadfuls, those sensationalist publications which he occasionally consulted for what he termed the pulse of popular imagination. He held it toward the firelight, and I could see the bold headline even from across the room. The Goblin thief strikes again. 5th victim in Fleet Street. The popular press, Holmes continued, his tone carrying that particular dryness which indicated he found the matter simultaneously absurd and intriguing, has been quite captivated by a series of peculiar thefts occurring in the vicinity of Fleet Street. 5 separate incidents over the past fortnight, each occurring during the darkest hours before dawn. Each victim awakening to find their most precious possessions vanished without evidence of forced entry, without sound, without trace. And in each case, Watson, the only clue left behind, is a small footprint, no larger than a child's hand, pressed into the dust or marked faintly in spilled powder, always near a window, always suggesting something impossibly small gained entrance where no human burglar could pass. I set aside my newspaper and leaned forward, the familiar thrill of an emerging mystery beginning to dispel the evening's drowsiness. Surely you do not suggest actual supernatural involvement? I suggest nothing, Holmes replied, though the faintest smile played at the corners of his mouth. I merely observe that London's imagination has been captured by the notion that some creature from old tales has taken residence in our modern city. The police, naturally, dismiss it as the work of a clever child, or perhaps a trained monkey. Yet Inspector Lestrade himself admitted to me this very afternoon that he finds the case most vexing. No child could navigate the routes taken. No animal could select with such precision the most valuable items while leaving obvious treasures untouched. And the footprints themselves, Watson, he has preserved casts. They are quite unlike anything in his considerable collection of criminal evidence. The fire crackled loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and I found myself glancing toward our rain-streaked window, imagining for just a moment some small, impossible figure perched upon the sill, watching us with ancient eyes. But of course, there was nothing there save darkness and the wavering reflection of our own comfortable room. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps ascending our stairs interrupted the moment. Not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, but something more hesitant, accompanied by the tapping of what might be a walking stick. Holmes's eyebrows rose with interest, and he called out, "Enter, if you please," before our visitor could even knock. The door opened to reveal a gentleman of perhaps 60 years, his silver hair plastered to his skull by rain, his expensive overcoat darkened with moisture despite the umbrella he carried. But it was his expression which captured immediate attention, a mixture of distress and embarrassment, the look of a rational man forced by circumstances to venture into territory he would normally dismiss as nonsense. Mrs. Hudson appeared behind him, her kind face worried, and Holmes gestured graciously toward the chair nearest the fire. "Please, sir, warm yourself. Mrs. Hudson, might we trouble you for tea? And perhaps some of those excellent biscuits, if any remain." Our landlady nodded and withdrew, while our visitor divested himself of his wet outer garments and settled gratefully before the hearth, his hands trembling slightly as he extended them toward the warmth. "Forgive the intrusion at this late hour. he began, his voice cultured, the accent suggesting Cambridge education and considerable social standing. "My name is Edmund Blackwood, and I am, or rather, I was, until this morning, a man of purely scientific disposition. I have spent 40 years as a senior editor at the Times, a position which demands skepticism, verification, and absolute devotion to observable fact. I have dismissed more fanciful stories than I could count, have laughed at superstition, and scoffed at supernatural suggestion. And yet, Mr. Holmes, I find myself in the impossible position of having experienced something that defies every rational explanation I can construct." Holmes had gone very still, that predatory stillness which overtook him when a truly interesting problem presented itself. "You are, I perceive, the 6th victim of the so-called Goblin thief." Blackwood's eyes widened. "How could you possibly? But of course, you are Sherlock Holmes." "Yes, precisely correct. This very morning I awoke in my home on Chancery Lane, quite near Fleet Street, as I am certain you know, to discover that my study had been burgled during the night. Nothing was disturbed, mind you, no violence done to lock or window, but gone. Gone was my most treasured possession." He paused, and in that moment I heard Mrs. Hudson returning with the tea tray, the gentle clink of china announcing her approach. She entered quietly, set the service upon the small table between our chairs, and departed with a discretion which made her invaluable. I poured for our guest, noting how his hands steadied slightly once warmed by the cup. "What was taken?" Holmes inquired gently. "A manuscript," Blackwood replied, staring into his tea as though seeking answers in its depths. "An illuminated medieval manuscript which has been in my family for 12 generations, passed from father to eldest child, a thing of extraordinary beauty and, I confess, considerable monetary value. But more than that, Mr. Holmes, it contained within its margins a series of annotations written in an ancient hand which I have spent decades attempting to decipher. They speak of—" He hesitated, clearly struggling with the absurdity of his own words. "They speak of old bargains, old promises made between the human world and something else. Something that dwelt in London long before London became London, when these lands were dark forest and misty hills. Before you fall asleep, perhaps you might write in the comments what time it is where you are, where you journey from to join us here. I always wonder who gathers in these quiet hours." The manuscript suggested that certain old families made agreements with these elder things, trading gifts and services across the centuries, maintaining what was described as the balance between seen and unseen. The rain intensified against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 10 deep, reverberating notes that seemed to sink into the very foundations of the building. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the wet darkness of Baker Street below, where the gas lamps created islands of amber light in an ocean of shadow. "And the footprint?" he asked softly. "Upon my window-sill," Blackwood confirmed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Pressed into the morning condensation, no larger than a child's hand, but the shape, Mr. Holmes, the toes too long, the arch too pronounced, the whole configuration somehow wrong. I am not an imaginative man, yet I confess that when I saw it, I felt a chill quite beyond what the autumn air could produce." Holmes remained at the window for a long moment, his silhouette dark against the rain-blurred glass. and I could sense the machinery of his remarkable mind engaging with this puzzle, sorteth this puzzle, sorting through possibilities, discarding the impossible, arranging facts into patterns that would eventually reveal their hidden logic. When he turned back toward us, his eyes held that luminous quality which appeared when a case particularly captured his interest, when the game was afoot and all the considerable powers of his intellect focused upon a single point. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, returning to his chair with fluid grace, "I should very much like to examine your home, if you would permit it. Not tonight, for the rain has made the streets quite miserable, and the evidence, such as it is, will keep until morning. But I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity on several preliminary matters. Firstly, where precisely was the manuscript kept? Secondly, who among your household, your friends, your professional acquaintances, knew of its existence and its significance? And thirdly, and I ask you to consider this most carefully, have you noticed anything unusual in recent weeks? Any sense of being observed? Any small disturbances that seemed insignificant at the time, but which in retrospect might suggest preparation for this theft?" Our visitor sipped his tea, the warm liquid seeming to restore some measure of his composure, and when he spoke again, his voice carried more of its natural authority, that confidence born of decades navigating the corridors of power and information. "The manuscript resided in a locked cabinet within my study, itself a room I keep secured when absent. The key I carry always upon my person, and I can account for every moment of its custody. As for who knew of it, fewer than one might imagine. My colleagues at the Times are aware I collect medieval texts, but I have been rather secretive about this particular volume. My late wife knew its full significance, as did my daughter Eleanor, who shares my fascination with historical mysteries. Beyond them, only my solicitor, for insurance purposes, and perhaps 2 or 3 fellow scholars with whom I have corresponded regarding certain passages." He paused, his brow furrowing with the effort of recollection, and the fire shifted in its grate, settling with a soft whisper of falling ash. Outside, the rain had found a new rhythm, steadier now, a constant susurration like the breathing of the city itself. "As for unusual occurrences," Blackwood continued slowly, "now that you press me to consider it, there have been small things, a sense, perhaps 3 weeks past, of being followed during my evening constitutional through Lincoln's Inn Fields. Nothing I could substantiate, merely a feeling, you understand. And twice I found my study window unlatched in the morning, though I am certain I secured it the night before. I attributed this to my own absent-mindedness, the distraction of age, but now I wonder. There was also a morning when I discovered muddy marks upon my windowsill. This was perhaps 10 days ago, but they were unclear, smudged, and I assumed some industrious pigeon had left them." Holmes nodded, his fingers forming that familiar steeple before his face. "And the night of the theft itself, did you hear nothing? Experience no unusual dreams or sensations?" "That is perhaps the strangest element," Blackwood admitted, and now genuine unease crept into his expression. "I slept most profoundly, Mr. Holmes, more deeply than is my custom. I am typically a light sleeper, roused by the slightest sound. Yet that night I descended into such absolute oblivion that when I finally awoke, past my usual hour, I felt almost drugged. My head ached, my thoughts were clouded, and it was only when I entered my study that full consciousness seemed to return. The window stood open, though I know I closed it. The cabinet door hung ajar, and the manuscript was gone. In its place, lying upon my desk, was a single object that had certainly not been there previously. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew something wrapped in a clean handkerchief, which he handed to Holmes with evident reluctance. My friend unwrapped it carefully, and there, upon the white linen, lay a small carved figure, no larger than my thumb, fashioned from some dark wood worn smooth with age. It depicted a creature that might have been human in distant ancestry, but which had evolved or been transformed into something quite other. Elongated limbs, oversized eyes, pointed ears, and expression of mischievous wisdom that seemed almost alive in the firelight. "Blackwood oak," Holmes murmured, bringing the figure close to examine it with his magnifying lens, which he had produced from some pocket, with the casual efficiency of long habit. Carved with significant skill, considerable age. Note the patterner, Watson, the way generations of handling have polished certain surfaces, while others retain tool marks. This is no modern forgery produced to enhance a hoax. I should estimate it to be perhaps 200 years old, possibly older. See here, these symbols incised along the base. They are not decorative. They are writing of a sort, though not in any alphabet currently in common use. I moved closer to observe the tiny figure, and indeed, there was something unsettling about it, some quality that suggested it is not merely a representation, but perhaps had once been regarded as something more, a talisman, an offering, a token of something best left unexamined in the rational light of day. The wood itself seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it, and the shadows it cast appeared somehow deeper than they should. "May I retain this for examination?" Holmes asked, and Blackwood nodded readily, clearly relieved to have the thing out of his possession. Holmes wrapped it once more and set it upon the mantelpiece, then refreshed our guest's tea with his own hands, a gesture of consideration that revealed how seriously he regarded the man's distress. "I shall call upon you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, if that proves convenient," Holmes said. "I should like to examine your study in detail, to inspect the window and its approaches, and perhaps to interview your daughter if she is available. In the meantime, I recommend you secure your home as thoroughly as possible, though I suspect our thief will not return to the same location. The pattern suggests systematic progression through a specific list of targets, and you have already served that purpose. Rest as well as you are able, Mr. Blackwood, and take comfort in the knowledge that however strange this matter may appear, there will be a rational explanation at its heart. There always is, even when that explanation requires us to expand our definitions of what rationality encompasses." Blackwood departed shortly thereafter, substantially calmer than when he had arrived, the simple act of sharing his burden and engaging a capable mind apparently worth more than any reassurances. Mrs. Hudson saw him out, and I heard their voices fading down the stairs, followed by the opening and closing of the street door. And then the rain swallowed all other sounds. Holmes immediately seized the carved figure from the mantelpiece and settled into his chair, lens in one hand, the object in the other, his entire being radiating that focused intensity, which meant he would likely remain thus engaged for hours. I knew better than to interrupt such contemplation, so I refreshed my own tea, now lukewarm but serviceable, and returned to my chair, content to sit in companionable silence while the fire crackled and the rain whispered against the windows, and London settled deeper into the night around us. "Watson," Holmes said at length, not looking up from his examination. "What do you know of London's pre-Roman history?" I confessed my ignorance was substantial. Beyond vague notions of Celtic tribes and ancient forests, very little. It was not a subject emphasized in medical school. Nor should it have been, Holmes agreed, finally setting down his lens and fixing me with that penetrating gaze. "And yet, my dear fellow, beneath the London we know, the London of gas lamps and railways and the stock exchange, there lies another London entirely. The Romans built their city upon existing sacred sites. The Saxons built upon Roman foundations. The Normans built upon Saxon foundations. And so on, layer upon layer, each civilization constructing its monuments atop what came before, sometimes ignorant of what they buried, sometimes deliberately choosing these locations precisely because power had accumulated there across centuries. The result is that certain places in modern London occupy ground that has been considered significant for 2,000 years or more." He rose and went to his bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines until he located a particular volume, ancient, leather-bound, the gilt lettering on its spine long since faded. "This charming text," he continued, returning with the book, "is an 18th century compilation of London folklore, gathered by a rather obsessive clergyman who feared such knowledge would be lost to modernization. Listen to this passage." Holmes opened to a marked page and read aloud, his voice taking on the cadence of the antique prose. "In the ward of Farringdon within, whereat Fleet Street doth run, there anciently dwelt those whom the common folk called the small ones, the hidden folk, the Goblin market-keepers. These were said to inhabit the spaces between, the forgotten tunnels and buried streams, the cellars beneath cellars, and to emerge only in darkness to trade with those who kept the old bargains. What they gave and what they took varied by account, but all agreed that certain families held pacts with them, renewed each generation, and that to break such pacts invited misfortune most severe." The fire popped loudly, a coal splitting with a sharp report that made me start slightly, and Holmes looked up from the book with an expression I could not quite read, part amusement, part fascination, and perhaps a trace of something deeper, some recognition that we stood at the threshold of a mystery that might challenge even his considerable powers of rationality. "Fleet Street," I observed, "the very location where these thefts occur." "Precisely, Watson, and note that all the victims thus far have been not random citizens, but rather individuals of old London families, the sort whose lineages extend back centuries, whose names appear in medieval guild records and Tudor court documents. Mr. Blackwood himself, I noticed, wears a signet ring bearing heraldry I recognize from a 15th century manuscript I once consulted regarding the Cheapside hoard. These are not chance victims. They are selected with purpose, with knowledge, with access to information that suggests either extensive research or... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air between us like smoke. Or something else entirely. Something that remembered old agreements and had come to collect what it believed it was owed. The clock upon the mantel chimed the half-hour, its gentle notes a reminder of time's steady passage, and I found myself suppressing a yawn, the combination of warmth and rain, and the late hour finally asserting their soporific influence. Holmes noticed, as he noticed everything, and smiled with genuine affection. "To bed with you, Watson. Tomorrow promises considerable activity, and you shall need your rest, I intend to spend another hour with our mysterious figurine and these folkloric texts, but I shall endeavour not to disturb your slumber with excessive pacing or violin playing at inappropriate hours. Morning arrived, not with fanfare, but with the gradual awareness of changed light filtering through my eyelids, the quality of illumination shifting from the deep black of true nin, shifting from the deep black of true night, to the softer charcoal grey of London dawn. I surfaced from sleep slowly, reluctantly, my dreams having been populated with strange figures moving through shadowed streets, their footsteps making no sound upon the wet cobblestones. For a moment I lay still, oriented myself to waking reality, and became aware that the rain had finally ceased its 3-day siege, leaving behind that peculiar stillness which follows storms, as though the city itself were holding its breath. From below came the gentle sounds of Mrs. Hudson preparing breakfast, the homely clatter of dishes, and the welcome aroma of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. I rose, performed my morning ablutions, dressed in clothes suitable for what would likely prove a day of investigation through London's older quarters, and descended to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, though his plate sat untouched while he pored over what appeared to be a collection of old maps spread across the white tablecloth, their yellowed surfaces marked with his penciled annotations. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me without looking up, his voice carrying that particular brightness which suggested he had either not slept at all or had achieved some breakthrough during his nocturnal studies. "Coffee is fresh, Mrs. Hudson's eggs are perfection itself, and I have spent the past several hours making the most fascinating discoveries about the subterranean geography of the Fleet Street area. Did you know that beneath the modern streets there runs an entire network of Roman tunnels, medieval crypts, and Tudor drainage channels, most of them now forgotten, sealed off, marked on no contemporary map? It is quite extraordinary how much of old London persists beneath the new, like archaeological layers in some ancient tell. I poured coffee, filled my plate, and settled across from him, studying the maps which appeared to span several centuries. Some showed London as it had been in medieval times, the streets following different courses, the river wider and less constrained. Others depicted the Roman city of Londinium, its walls and gates marked in careful Latin script. Holmes had overlaid these historical maps with modern street plans, creating a palimpsest of urban evolution that revealed patterns invisible to the casual observer. "See here," he continued, his finger tracing a path through the tangle of old streets. "Fleet Street derives its name from the River Fleet, which once flowed openly from Hampstead down to the Thames, but which has been progressively buried over centuries, now running entirely underground in a great brick culvert. Along its course, particularly in the medieval period, there clustered certain establishments, alchemical laboratories, print shops, taverns of dubious repute, all trades that benefited from water access, and perhaps from a certain degree of obscurity. And notice this: every single location from which our goblin thief has struck lies within 200 yards of the old fleet's course. Every single one. This observation, delivered with quiet satisfaction, suggested a pattern emerging from apparent chaos, that transformation of random data into meaningful structure, which was the hallmark of Holmes's method. I leaned closer, tracing the marked locations with my own finger, and indeed, the relationship became clear once pointed out. 5 victims, now 6 with Blackwood, all residing or keeping offices in buildings that unknowingly sat atop, or immediately adjacent to the buried river's path. You believe the thief uses these old tunnels to move about unseen, I ventured. I believe it possible, even probable, that our thief possesses knowledge of routes through the underworld of London that would serve such a purpose admirably. Whether this knowledge derives from careful historical research or from some other source remains to be determined. But consider, Watson, if you wish to enter locked rooms without forcing doors or windows, if you wish to appear and disappear as though by supernatural means, what better method than to use passages whose very existence has been forgotten by the modern world? Mrs. Hudson entered with fresh toast, took one look at her abused tablecloth beneath Holmes's maps, sighed with the patience of long experience, and departed without comment. Holmes absently helped himself to toast while continuing his exposition, crumbs falling unnoticed onto a particularly fine 16th century survey. "Our appointment with Mr. Blackwood is at 10 o'clock, he said, consulting his watch. "That allows us time to fortify ourselves properly. I anticipate we shall spend much of the day examining his premises, interviewing his daughter, and quite possibly venturing into some rather less pleasant locations in pursuit of our investigation. I suggest sturdy boots and a coat you do not mind subjecting to dust and dampness." We finished our breakfast in contemplative silence, my mind turning over the implications of Holmes's discoveries. If the thief indeed used forgotten tunnels, that suggested someone with access to rare historical documents, someone who had spent considerable time researching old London, someone who possessed not only knowledge, but also the physical courage to navigate dark underground passages. It narrowed the field somewhat, transforming a seemingly supernatural mystery into a problem of historical expertise and urban exploration. The cab ride to Chancery Lane took us through streets washed clean by rain, the morning light reflecting off wet pavements in a manner that made the city seem almost beautiful, softened somehow, gentled by water and sunshine. Barristers in their sombre attire hurried toward the law courts. Clerks carried armloads of documents between offices, and a flower seller on the corner offered violets with a cheerfulness that suggested she had forgotten the dreary days just past, and embraced this moment of brightness with full heart. Mr. Blackwood's residence proved to be a handsome Georgian townhouse of rose-coloured brick, its windows tall and well-proportioned, its small front garden tended with evident care. A maid answered our knock and showed us immediately to the study on the first floor, where Blackwood himself awaited us in company with a young woman whom he introduced as his daughter Eleanor. She was perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in practical deep blue, her dark hair pulled back in a simple arrangement, and her eyes, her father's eyes, held that same quality of intelligent inquiry I had noted in him. She shook hands with firm pressure, appraising us with a directness that suggested she had inherited more than merely physical features from her father. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice pleasant and cultured, "my father has explained the situation. I confess I am grateful you have agreed to investigate, Mr. Holmes. This affair has disturbed him greatly, and beyond the monetary loss, which is substantial, the manuscript held immense sentimental value. It has been in our family since the Tudor period, passed down through generations, and the thought that it might be sold to some unknowing collector, or, worse, destroyed through ignorance of its significance, is most distressing." Holmes bowed slightly, acknowledging her concern. then turned his attention to the study itself. It was a scholar's room, lined floor to ceiling with books, dominated by a large desk positioned to catch light from the tall windows, and containing that comfortable disorder which suggests active intellectual work rather than mere display. The cabinet from which the manuscript had been taken stood open, its lock intact, showing no evidence of tampering. "The window, if you please," Holmes said, and Blackwood led us to it, a casement window of the sort common in Georgian construction, opening outward on hinges, now closed but unlatched. Holmes examined the latch mechanism minutely with his glass, then requested it be opened. The window swung outward, and immediately we could see what had so disturbed Blackwood. There upon the exterior stone sill, faint but unmistakable in a residue of dried rainwater and dust, was the print he had described, small, elongated, the toe marks too long, suggesting something that was not quite human, and yet not quite animal either. Holmes produced a tape measure and carefully recorded its dimensions, then took out his notebook and made a quick sketch, capturing the precise arrangement of the unusual features. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "The depth of impression suggests considerable weight despite the small size. This is no child's footprint, no trained monkey. Whatever made this mark possessed both mass and intention. Note also the placement. It is positioned as though the creature crouched here, examining the interior before entering. And see this mark beside it. That is where something rested, perhaps a tool or implement used to manipulate the latch from outside." He produced a small envelope and carefully collected samples of the residue, then turned his attention to the building's exterior wall. We descended to the street level, and Holmes examined the facade with minute care, eventually discovering faint scratch marks in the mortar between bricks, marks that ascended from ground level to the study window in a nearly vertical line. "Something climbed," I observed, stating the obvious. "Something climbed with remarkable agility," Holmes corrected. "Note the spacing of these marks. They suggest limbs of unusual proportion, longer than human arms, relative to body size, perhaps, and the strength required to ascend a flat wall using only these tiny purchase points would be considerable. A teacup shattered somewhere within the house, the sudden crash followed by a maid's murmured apology, and the everyday sound seemed to break some spell, reminding us that we stood in ordinary London, in broad daylight, examining evidence of something that defied ordinary explanation. We returned to the study where Eleanor Blackwood awaited us, and Holmes requested permission to examine the desk where the carved figure had been left. She granted it readily, and Holmes spent long minutes going over every surface, eventually discovering something that made him emit a small sound of satisfaction. He beckoned me closer, and there, barely visible in the wood grain, were more of those symbols we had seen on the carved figurine, etched so finely that they appeared almost accidental, as though drawn by a pin or needlepoint. "Miss Blackwood," Holmes said, straightening, "your father mentioned you share his interest in the manuscript. Had you studied it closely? Can you describe its contents with any specificity?" She moved to join us, her expression thoughtful. "I had transcribed several sections, Mr. Holmes, attempting to decode the marginal annotations my father mentioned. The main text was a fairly standard illuminated psalter from the late 13th century, beautiful, but not extraordinary. But the annotations were something else entirely. they appeared to be a family record of sorts, documenting exchanges between the Blackwood family and something referred to only as the hidden folk of the fleet. Gifts given and received across generations, iron tools traded for luck in business, songs sung in exchange for protection from plague, that sort of thing. Very specific, very detailed, as though recording actual transactions. And the most recent entries? Holmes prompted gently. Eleanor hesitated, exchanging a glance with her father. The most recent entry was made by my great-great-grandfather in 1803. It recorded what he called the breaking of the bargain. He wrote that the family could no longer maintain the old agreements, that the modern age made such things impossible, that the hidden folk must understand and release them from ancient obligations. After that entry, there was only a response, written in a different hand entirely, old-fashioned, cramped, difficult to read, stating that bargains once made could not be unmade by mortal will alone, that debts accumulated across centuries, and that, when the time came, what was owed would be collected. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a long-case clock in the corner, its measured rhythm marking the passage of moments as we absorbed the implications of her words. Holmes stood very still, his grey eyes distant, processing this new information, arranging it alongside everything else he had learned. "One final question," he said at last. "The other victims of these thefts, do you know their names?" Blackwood produced a list, copied from newspaper accounts. Thornton, Aldersgate, Whitmore, Ludgate Hill, Fenwick, Shoe Lane, Mortimer, Fetter Lane, and Ashford, Blackfriars, 5 families, now 6 with the Blackwoods, all residing along the ancient fleet's course. Holmes studied the list with an expression I had learned to recognize, the look of a hunter who has caught the scent and knows the chase has truly begun. He thanked the Blackwoods for their cooperation, promised to communicate any developments, and we departed into the bright autumn morning, leaving them to their violated sanctuary and their stolen inheritance. As our cab rattled back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before his face, his gaze fixed on something invisible to ordinary sight. Finally he spoke, his voice soft beneath the clatter of hooves and wheels. "Watson, I believe we shall need to descend into the underworld of London to solve this mystery. Quite literally, I mean. There are men who know the old tunnels, who work in the sewers and culverts, who can guide us through passages forgotten by the modern city. Tomorrow, I think, we shall engage such a guide and venture into the darkness beneath Fleet Street. For if our thief uses those routes, then we must follow, and perhaps in following we shall discover not only the means, but also the motive behind these most peculiar crimes." The British Museum reading room possessed a quality of hushed reverence that afternoon, the great dominant afternoon, the great domed ceiling arching overhead like the vault of some secular cathedral, while beneath it scholars bent to their work with the devotion of monks illuminating manuscripts. Dust motes drifted through shafts of pale sunlight that descended from the high windows, dancing in their lazy spiral down to where Holmes and I sat, surrounded by a fortress of ancient volumes, maps, and documents spread across our designated table in careful arrangement. Holmes had spent the journey from Baker Street in animated conversation about what he termed the archaeology of obligation, explaining how certain debts, whether financial, social, or in this case something altogether stranger, could persist across generations, accumulating interest not merely monetary, but existential. "Consider, Watson," he had said, as our cab navigated the streets toward Bloomsbury, that in societies which maintain oral traditions and extended family structures, memory extends much further than our modern, fragmented existence might suggest. What seems ancient history to us might, to others, be as immediate as yesterday's newspaper. Now he worked through a stack of medieval guild records with the systematic patience that characterized his research methods, his long fingers turning pages with surprising gentleness, his eyes scanning the dense Latin text with the ease of long familiarity. I had been assigned a collection of 19th century surveys of London's underground infrastructure, documents commissioned during the Great Sewer Works and railway excavations, which revealed with surprising detail the hidden geography beneath our feet. "Here," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible in the reading room's ecclesiastical quiet, "is a reference to the Blackwood family in a 1587 merchant's registry. They were goldsmiths, Watson, working in the Cheapside area, quite prosperous by all accounts. And note this marginal annotation, known for fair dealing with all manner of folk." That last phrase, "all manner," appears to be emphasized in the original hand, as though the clerk wished to convey something beyond the obvious meaning. I leaned across to examine the faded script, and indeed, the phrase had been written with particular care, the letters slightly larger, more deliberate. "You believe it refers to the hidden folk?" I believe that in an era when such concepts held more currency, when the boundary between folklore and daily life was less rigidly policed by scientific rationalism, such references would be understood by those initiated into the knowledge. The guild records of medieval London are full of coded language, Watson, ways of communicating information that the uninitiated would overlook entirely. This may well be an acknowledgement that the Blackwoods maintained relationships beyond the purely human commercial sphere. A librarian passed our table, his shoes whispering across the polished floor, and he paused to ensure our documents were being handled with proper care before continuing his rounds. The interruption broke my concentration, and I found my gaze drifting upward to the great dome, imagining the weight of knowledge contained in this vast room, centuries of human inquiry and discovery pressed between leather covers, waiting for minds capable of extracting meaning from their accumulated wisdom. I returned my attention to the survey documents before me, and within moments discovered something that quickened my pulse. "Holmes, listen to this," from an 1858 report on the Fleet Ditch. During excavation work near Shoe Lane, workmen encountered a chamber of considerable age, its walls bearing markings of no recognizable period or style. The chamber connected to passages leading in multiple directions, though most were blocked by collapse or deliberate sealing. The foreman reported that his men refused to work in that section after experiencing what they described as unsettling sounds and the sensation of being observed. The chamber was ultimately sealed with brick and concrete, its location marked only in the surveyor's private notes. Holmes's head snapped up with immediate interest. Does the document indicate where these private notes might be located? I scanned the remaining text. It references the surveyor's name, Harold Pemberton, but provides no further detail about the disposition of his papers. However, the museum archives might. But Holmes was already gathering our materials with barely contained excitement, his movements quick and precise. The museum indeed maintains an extensive collection of personal papers from Victorian engineers and surveyors. If Pemberton's notes survive, they will be here, likely uncatalogued and gathering dust in some storage room, awaiting a researcher with specific reason to seek them. Come, Watson, we must speak with the archival staff immediately. Our inquiry at the main desk led to a consultation with the head archivist, a gentleman of advanced years named Cornelius Wickham, who possessed that particular combination of pedantic precision and genuine love of historical material that makes for the ideal custodian of the past. When Holmes explained our interest in Pemberton's surveys, Wickham's face brightened with the enthusiasm of one whose specialized knowledge is finally recognized and valued. Pemberton, yes, excellent surveyor, contributed significantly to the great sewer works under Bazalgette's direction, Wickham said, leading us through a door marked Staff Only, and down a corridor lined with storage rooms. His official reports are well known, but his personal papers came to us only 15 years ago, donated by a distant relation after his death. I cannot say they have been extensively examined since their arrival. The collection is quite substantial, several dozen boxes, mostly technical drawings and field notebooks. Ah, here we are. He unlocked a storage room whose shelves held the accumulated documentary evidence of Victorian London's transformation from medieval chaos to modern order. Boxes labelled with Pemberton's name occupied an entire section, and Wickham helped us carry several to a small work table, then left us with instructions about handling procedures and a promise to return within the hour to check on our progress. The notebooks proved to be meticulously maintained, each page dated and annotated with technical details, sketches, and occasional personal observations. Holmes worked through them with remarkable speed, his trained eye able to extract relevant information while discarding the merely technical. I followed more slowly, finding myself captivated by Pemberton's prose, which revealed a man of scientific training who nonetheless possessed a poetic sensibility about his work in London's depths. One entry, dated July 1858, described the discovery of the mysterious chamber. Descended today to the new excavation near Shoe Lane, where Matthews reported the men had broken through into an ancient structure. Found myself in a circular chamber, perhaps 15 feet in diameter. The walls composed of stone blocks fitted with extraordinary precision, no mortar visible. The markings Matthews mentioned cover every surface. Spirals, interlocking patterns, symbols that resemble no alphabet I have encountered in my studies. Most unsettling was the quality of air, which despite the chamber's depth and isolation, moved with suggestion of circulation from passages beyond our sight. The men's reluctance to work here I initially attributed to superstition, but I confess that after 2 hours in that space, I felt most strongly the sensation of wrongness, as though we had violated some boundary better left undisturbed. Holmes read this passage over my shoulder, then carefully turned the page to reveal a detailed sketch of the chamber and its markings. His intake of breath suggested recognition. "These symbols," he said quietly, pointing to a particular sequence that spiraled around what appeared to be a doorway, match those on the carved figure left in Blackwood's study. Not precisely identical, but clearly related, drawn from the same symbolic vocabulary. And see here, Pemberton has attempted a translation based on comparison with Celtic and Saxon runes. He suggests they represent concepts of passage, exchange, and debt. The scratching of Holmes's pencil as he copied the symbols filled the small room's silence, accompanied by the distant sounds of the museum's ordinary functioning. Footsteps in corridors, voices murmuring in reading rooms, the perpetual gentle rustle of paper and turning pages. Outside the high window, afternoon was advancing toward evening, the quality of light shifting from bright clarity to something softer, more golden, that spoke of autumn's gentle melancholy. Pemberton writes that he sealed the chamber, I noted, reading ahead in the notebook, but he included precise coordinates relative to permanent landmarks. He also mentions that before sealing it, he collected samples of the markings using paper and charcoal rubbings, which he deposited with the Royal Archaeological Society for future study. Then we must visit the society tomorrow, Holmes declared, making another quick sketch. But for this evening, I believe we have sufficient information to take the next step in our investigation. I sent a message this morning to a man named Tobias Fletcher, a tosher who knows the fleet's course as well as any living soul. He has agreed to meet us at 8 o'clock this evening at a public house near the Blackfriars entrance to the old Fleet culvert. With Pemberton's coordinates, Fletcher should be able to guide us to the sealed chamber, or, at least, to the general vicinity. I must have appeared less than enthusiastic about the prospect of venturing into London's sewers, for Holmes smiled with genuine warmth. I know it is not the most pleasant excursion, my dear fellow, but consider, if our theory is correct, if the thief uses these passages to move about unseen, then we must follow where the evidence leads, regardless of the amenities along the way. I promise we shall take every precaution, and perhaps we shall discover something that brings us significantly closer to solving this most unusual case. We returned the notebooks to Wickham with thanks, Holmes having filled several pages of his own notebook with copies of symbols, sketches, and relevant passages. The head archivist seemed delighted that his collection had proven useful, and made us promise to inform him of any discoveries that might add to the historical understanding of Pemberton's work. The cab ride back to Baker Street carried us through streets now busy with evening traffic, the working day concluding, shops beginning to close, street lamps being lit by men with their long poles moving from post to post in their eternal routine. Holmes sat quietly, his notebook open on his lap, studying the symbols he had copied, occasionally murmuring to himself as he noticed new connections or patterns. "You know, Watson," he said, as we turned onto our familiar street, "there is a principle in detective work that the bizarre and the apparently supernatural, when properly investigated, almost always resolve into the thoroughly natural, merely operating by rules or through means that were not previously understood. Yet, I confess that this case troubles me precisely because the evidence appears to support, rather than contradict, the supernatural interpretation. The footprints, the symbols, the pattern of victims, all descended from families with documented folkloric connections. It all coheres too neatly around the central premise that something old, something which remembers the ancient bargains, has indeed emerged to collect what it believes is owed. "But you don't actually believe in goblins," I said, making it half statement, half question. Holmes smiled, that enigmatic expression which suggested his thoughts ranged far beyond what he chose to articulate. "I believe in evidence, Watson. I believe in observation and deduction. If the evidence suggests the involvement of beings whose existence challenges our conventional understanding of the natural world, then I am prepared to follow that evidence wherever it leads. The universe is vast, old, and stranger than our philosophies typically acknowledge. Who are we to say with absolute certainty what does or does not exist in the forgotten spaces beneath our modern city? Mrs. Hudson had dinner waiting, bless her, and we ate with good appetite, despite, or perhaps because of, the knowledge that the evening held less comfortable prospects. Holmes laid out the equipment we would need: dark lanterns, stout walking sticks, India rubber boots, and oldest clothes suitable for subterranean exploration. He also produced 2 small revolvers, which he insisted we carry, though he hoped they would prove unnecessary. One can never be too careful when venturing into unknown territory, he said, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency. And while I do not anticipate violence, it seems prudent to prepare for all contingencies. As 8 o'clock approached, we gathered our equipment and descended to the street where Holmes had arranged for a cab to take us to Blackfriars. The evening had grown cool, a reminder that winter approached, despite autumn's lingering presence, and fog was beginning to form along the river, those first tentative wisps that would, by midnight, transform London into a labyrinth of reduced visibility and altered acoustics. The public house where we were to meet Fletcher proved to be a rough establishment, catering to workers from the wharves and warehouses, its interior thick with tobacco smoke and loud conversation. Holmes inquired at the bar, and we were directed to a back room where a solitary figure sat nursing a pint of porter, his weather-worn face and peculiar odour immediately identifying him as one who made his living in London's underground rivers. Tobias Fletcher rose as we entered, revealing a wiry frame of surprising strength, his handshake firm despite hands scarred by years of hard work. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing in his assessment of us. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rough but not unpleasant. "Got your message. Rare thing, gentlemen, wanting to go down the Fleet at night. But your coin's good, and I reckon you got reasons. I'll take you where you want to go, but I'll warn you now. The old river, she's got her moods. Sometimes she's quiet as a lamb, sometimes she roars like a demon. And there's places down there even I don't go, places that ain't natural, if you take my meaning." Holmes assured him we would heed his guidance, and after finishing his drink, Fletcher led us out into the foggy evening toward the river and the dark entrance to London's hidden waterways. Tensund Descent Sequence. The iron grating that marked the entrance to the Fleet culvert lay half concealed behind a warehouse wall, its existence unknown to the thousands who passed nearby each day, intent on their business in the lit and living world above. Fletcher produced a key of considerable age, its metal darkened by time and moisture, and with practiced efficiency worked the ancient lock until it yielded with a reluctant groan that seemed to echo down into depths we could not yet see. The grating swung inward on hinges that protested, despite evident recent use, revealing stone steps descending into absolute darkness, worn smooth by centuries of feet, both authorized and otherwise. Holmes lit his dark lantern, and I did the same, the yellow light seeming feeble against the profound blackness that waited below. The smell that emerged from the opening was not as foul as I had anticipated. Earth and stone and old water, certainly, but also something else, a mineral scent that spoke of ancient construction, of spaces sealed away from the ordinary processes of decay and renewal that governed the surface world. "Stay close and watch your footing," Fletcher advised, his own lamp already lit. its beam showing the way down, steps slick with perpetual dampness. The fleet runs maybe 15 feet below street level here, channeled through a brick culvert built 200 years back. But there's older ways too, passages that predate the culvert, and it's those we'll be seeking if your Mr. Pemberton's chamber is where I think it is. We descended single file, Fletcher leading, Holmes following, with the careful attention he brought to all physical activities, myself bringing up the rear and trying not to think too carefully about the weight of London pressing down above us. The buildings and streets, the sleeping thousands, the entire modern world continuing its existence in blissful ignorance of these hidden arteries that sustained its function. The steps numbered perhaps 30, though in the darkness and the heightened awareness that came with descent into unknown territory, counting proved difficult. The bottom opened into the main culvert, a brick tunnel perhaps 8 feet in height and 6 feet wide, its floor consisting of a raised walkway on either side of a central channel, through which the buried fleet ran with surprising vigour. The sound of water flowing was constant, not loud but persistent, a liquid whisper that filled the tunnel with white noise, drowning out the city sounds from above and creating an acoustic environment entirely unto itself. Our lanterns threw dancing shadows on the curved brick walls, revealing here and there patches of mineral deposits, gleaming white or pale green, where water had seeped through mortar over decades. The fleet gathers water from Hampstead and Highgate, Fletcher explained as we began walking along the eastern walkway, our boots splashing occasionally through shallow puddles. Even buried, she remembers her nature. After heavy rain, she can rise 6 feet or more, filling this whole culvert, so we're lucky we come on a dry spell. The water you see now, that's her normal flow, gentle enough, but constant. She's been running this course since before London was London, and she'll likely run it long after London's gone to dust. The philosophical observation, delivered in Fletcher's rough accent, seemed peculiarly appropriate to our surroundings. Here indeed was something that preceded human ambition, and would outlast it, a force of nature temporarily constrained by human engineering, but never truly tamed. We walked in silence for perhaps 10 minutes, the only sounds our footsteps, the flowing water, and occasionally the skitter of rats disturbed by our passage, though Fletcher assured us the rats were more frightened of us than we need be of them. Holmes paused periodically to consult his compass and the sketch he had made from Pemberton's notes, oriented himself in relation to the streets above. "We are now beneath Ludgate Hill," he announced at one point, his voice carrying strangely in the tunnel's acoustic. "Pemberton's chamber should be perhaps another 100 yards ahead, accessed through a side passage on the northern wall." He described it as being marked by a particularly large iron bracket, installed during Tudor times to support water management apparatus, now rusted but still recognizable. Fletcher nodded, his lamp swinging in arcs as he examined the walls more carefully. "I know the bracket you mean. Thought it was just old drainage works, never investigated beyond. But if your surveyor found something behind it, well, there's many things down here that ain't in any modern maps. The old London, she's still here, just buried. Sometimes I think she don't like being buried neither. Sometimes I think she remembers." We continued forward, and gradually I became aware that the tunnel was changing character. The Victorian brickwork remained constant, but something in the quality of the air shifted, became cooler, heavier somehow, carrying that mineral scent more strongly. And there, Holmes's lamp illuminated it first, the iron bracket Fletcher had mentioned, a massive piece of metalwork bolted into the wall, so corroded that its original purpose was indeed unrecognizable, but still sturdy, still performing whatever function time had assigned it. Fletcher approached and examined the wall around the bracket with professional interest, running his hands over the bricks, tapping here and there with his knuckles, listening to the variations in sound that returned. "There's hollow behind here," he concluded. "Not much, maybe a foot or two, then something solid. But see these bricks here? Different mortar, newer. This would be your Pemberton's ceiling work, I'd wager." Holmes had his own inspection underway, his magnifying glass emerging from a pocket to study the mortar joints with minute attention. Indeed, the mortar is of mid-Victorian composition, quite different from the Tudor work surrounding it. And here, scratched into one brick, look, Watson, Pemberton's initials and the date, HP 1858. He wished to mark his work should anyone later need to find it. The question that hung unspoken between us was whether we should disturb Pemberton's seal, breach the barrier he had erected between the modern world and whatever lay beyond. Holmes straightened from his examination and met Fletcher's gaze, then mine, and I saw in his expression that mixture of curiosity and determination that no mystery could withstand. "We must see what lies beyond," he said simply. "Fletcher, is it possible to remove some of these bricks without bringing the entire wall down upon us?" Fletcher considered, then nodded slowly. "Aye, if we're careful. I've got tools for this sort of work. Sometimes we need to access old drains and such. But I'll warn you both, once we open this, we may not like what we find. There's reasons men seal things up, and not always practical ones." He produced from a canvas bag a selection of chisels and a small hammer, and with remarkable skill began working at the mortar joints, carefully loosening bricks one at a time. The sound of metal on stone rang through the tunnel with sharp clarity, each strike seeming to penetrate deeper into the darkness, announcing our presence to whatever might dwell in the sealed spaces beyond. I found myself gripping my walking stick more tightly, aware of the revolver's weight in my coat pocket, trying to dismiss as mere fancy the sensation that we were being observed by eyes we could not see. The work took perhaps 20 minutes, Fletcher removing bricks with patient precision until an opening, perhaps 2 feet square, gaped in the wall like a mouth opening into deeper darkness. The air that emerged was different, colder certainly, but also carrying scents of stone never touched by sunlight, of spaces sealed for decades, and beneath it all something else, something organic but not quite identifiable, not quite comfortable. Holmes immediately directed his lamp through the opening, and we could see that beyond lay indeed a passage, not the neat Victorian brickwork of the culvert, but something far older. Rough stone walls, a floor that descended in uneven steps, and at the limits of our light, suggestions of the chamber Pemberton had described. "I shall go first," Holmes declared, already manoeuvring through the opening with the agility of long practice at gaining entrance to unusual locations. Fletcher and I followed, finding ourselves in a passage barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, the walls pressing close on either side, the ceiling low enough that we were forced to duck occasionally where the rock bulged downward. The passage descended perhaps 20 feet through what seemed to be natural rock, though here and there evidence of ancient toolwork suggested human widening and shaping. And then It opened into the chamber Pemberton had documented, and we stood in a space that stole the breath from my lungs with its impossible antiquity and its undeniable purposefulness. The chamber was circular, as described, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, its walls constructed of fitted stone blocks that predated any building technique I recognized. But it was the markings that commanded attention, covering every surface, carved or perhaps etched with some technique that had left them deep and clear despite what must have been centuries or millennia of existence. They spiraled, they interlocked, they formed patterns that seemed to shift in the lantern light, creating an almost hypnotic effect that made it difficult to focus on any single element. Holmes moved slowly around the chamber's perimeter, his lamp held high, his notebook already out to record what he observed. "These are not Celtic, not Saxon, not Roman," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "They predate all recorded settlement of this area. They are, Watson, they are identical in style to symbols found at certain megalithic sites in the far north of Scotland, at locations associated with the oldest layers of British habitation, the people who were here before the Celts, before written history began." In the centre of the chamber stood a stone platform, waist high, its surface worn smooth by what might have been countless hands touching it across the ages. And resting upon that platform, clearly placed recently, for no object of such materials could have survived millennia in these conditions, was a wooden box of medieval construction, its surface carved with symbols that matched those on the chamber walls. Holmes approached it slowly, almost reverently, and with careful hands lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth of relatively modern manufacture, lay several objects. A manuscript, immediately recognizable as Blackwood's stolen treasure, a gold torque of Celtic design, a small stone carved with protective symbols, and most strangely, a modern pocket watch, its case engraved with a family crest I could not identify. "The other stolen items," I breathed. "This is where the thief brings them." "Not merely brings them," Holmes corrected softly, lifting the manuscript with gentle hands. "This is where they are offered. See how they are arranged. Not casually discarded, but deliberately placed, each object positioned with care, wrapped to preserve it. This is a ritual space, Watson. The items are not stolen for profit, but collected as tribute, as payment for debts the thief believes are owed." A sound echoed through the passage behind us, not loud, but distinct, the scrape of something moving in the darkness, approaching from deeper chambers we had not yet explored. Fletcher's hand went to his belt, where he carried a stout knife, and I felt Holmes tense beside me, his attention shifting from the box to the shadows that pressed against our lantern light. The scraping sound came closer, and with it, now I could hear something else, a breathing, soft and steady, and beneath that, a kind of humming, wordless but melodic, as though whoever approached sang to themselves in the darkness, content in their ancient purpose, unconcerned with our intrusion into their sacred space. The humming grew clearer as whatever approached drew nearer through the darkness, and I found myself struck by how utterly unhurried it seemed, how without concern for our presence or our lanterns, or the fact that we had penetrated to this most secret of places. The melody, if such it could be called, carried no tune I recognized, yet possessed an ancient quality, the kind of wordless song that might have been old when Rome was young, passed down through generations until its origins dissolved into the mists of time immemorial. Holmes held up a hand, cautioning us to remain still, and we stood frozen in that circular chamber, our light steady, our breathing shallow, waiting for the darkness to reveal what it had hidden. The figure that emerged from the passage moved with a fluidity that seemed almost liquid in the uncertain light, and my first impression was of impossible proportions. Limbs too long for the torso, fingers that extended in ways human fingers should not, a frame both slight and suggesting considerable strength in its wiry construction. It wore clothing of a sort, though whether the dark material was leather or fabric, or something else entirely, I could not immediately discern, and it carried nothing in its hands, save a small pouch that hung from a cord around its narrow waist. The face, when it turned toward us, and our lights fell full upon it, was not monstrous as my imagination had begun to fear, but rather uncanny in its almost humanity. Large eyes that caught and reflected our lamplight with a golden sheen, features that might have been human generations ago, but had diverged down some separate evolutionary path, becoming something distinct, something adapted to darkness and narrow spaces, and a life lived in the forgotten margins of the modern world. We stood regarding one another across perhaps 10 feet of ancient stone floor, 3 men from the surface world, and this singular being from the depths, and the moment stretched until it became almost unbearable in its tension. Then the creature, for I knew not what else to name it, spoke, and its voice was surprisingly clear, accented in ways I had never heard but perfectly comprehensible, carrying a tone not of threat, but of mild curiosity, mixed with what might have been amusement. "You are Holmes," it said, not as question but statement, and those golden eyes fixed upon my friend with an intensity that suggested recognition. "The one who solves puzzles, who sees what others miss, who applies reason to mystery. I wondered if you would come. The Blackwood summoned you, yes? Complained of theft, of violation, of loss. They always complain, these ones who break bargains and then object when debts are collected." Holmes stepped forward slightly, his posture relaxed, non-threatening, his voice when he spoke, carrying that same courtesy he might extend to any client in his Baker Street rooms. "I am indeed Sherlock Holmes, and these are my companions, Dr. Watson and Mr. Fletcher. Might we know your name, or how we should properly address you? For I confess, this is a meeting I had hoped for, but hardly expected to achieve with such directness." The creature tilted its head, a gesture so bird-like that it seemed to confirm its fundamental otherness, and yet the intelligence in its gaze was unmistakable, equal to any human I had encountered, and perhaps possessing depths of experience we could barely imagine. "Names have power," it said slowly, "and mine has not been spoken aloud in your tongue for many generations. But you may call me Cinder, for I was born in the time of great fires, when this city burned and was remade, and I have carried that memory through all the years since. I am the keeper of bargains for the hidden folk of the fleet, and I perform duties that were ancient when your grandfathers' grandfathers walked these lands." Fletcher had remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see in his weathered face an expression of profound vindication, as though everything he had ever suspected about the strangeness lurking in London's depths had been confirmed in this single impossible encounter. He nodded slowly, accepting, apparently less surprised than either Holmes or myself, that the old stories had foundation in fact. Holmes gestured toward the box upon the stone platform. These items you have collected. The Blackwoods call it theft, but you term it debt collection. Perhaps you might explain the distinction, for I confess my understanding of the situation is incomplete, and I have always believed that knowledge dispels fear while ignorance breeds it. Cinder moved toward the platform, its movements so fluid that it seemed to glide rather than walk, and with those elongated fingers, 6 on each hand, I now noticed, it touched the box with something approaching tenderness. "You're kind," it began, its voice taking on a tone that might have been that of a teacher addressing willing but ignorant students. "Build your cities upon layers of forgetting. You construct new upon old. You pave over sacred spaces. You channel rivers and cut down forests and erect your buildings of brick and stone. And with each layer, you forget what came before. But we do not forget. We cannot forget, for memory is our inheritance, our burden, our purpose." It paused, and in the silence I became aware that the humming had not ceased, but had become a background presence, emanating not from Cinder itself, but from deeper chambers still, suggesting that we were not in the presence of a lone being, but rather a representative of something larger, a community that dwelt in these forgotten spaces beneath the modern world. "Centuries ago," Cinder continued, "when the fleet ran open under sun and stars, when the forests grew thick, where now your streets stretch, certain of your ancestors made bargains with my people. They were practical bargains, mutually beneficial. We possessed knowledge of the hidden places, of where metals could be found, of how to work them, of secrets the earth holds. They possessed ability to move in the daylight world, to trade, to prosper. So agreements were made, formalized, witnessed by both peoples. The human families would provide offerings, iron tools which we prized, works of beauty which we treasured, songs and stories which we collected. In return, we would share our knowledge, provide protection, guide their enterprises toward success. The Blackwoods prospered greatly through our bargain, as did the Thorntons, the Whitmores, the Fenwicks, the Mortimers, the Ashfords, all the families from whom I have recently collected." Holmes had been listening with complete attention, his eyes never leaving Cinder's face, and I could see him fitting this information into the framework of evidence he had accumulated. "But the bargains were broken," he prompted gently. "Not broken," Cinder corrected, and now its voice carried a note of something like sadness. "Forgotten. As the generations passed, as your world changed, as reason replaced belief, and science dispelled what you termed superstition, the families ceased to honor the agreements. They kept the benefits, the wealth accumulated, the properties acquired, the social positions attained, but they stopped providing the offerings, stopped acknowledging the debt. Some forgot entirely, others remembered but chose to disbelieve, to treat the old family records as quaint folklore rather than binding contracts. And so the debt accumulated, year upon year, decade upon decade, until it became substantial enough to demand collection. A drop of water fell from the chamber's ceiling, landing with a clear note in a small depression in the stone floor, and the sound seemed to punctuate Cinder's words, to mark the passage of time in its most elemental form. Holmes moved closer to the platform, examining the collected items with careful attention. "These objects," he said thoughtfully, "they have significance beyond their monetary value. Each represents something specific to the family that possessed it." "Yes," Cinder confirmed, seeming pleased by Holmes's perception. The Blackwood manuscript recorded the original bargain and its terms. The Thornton Talk was made with our knowledge of metalworking, our gift to their ancestor. The Whitmore stone carried protective symbols we taught them to carve. Each item represents the connection, the debt acknowledged in physical form. By reclaiming them, I complete a cycle. I close an account that has stood open too long. It is not theft, Mr. Holmes. It is accounting. I found my voice at last, the question emerging before I could consider its wisdom. But why now? Why, after so many years of patience, did you choose this moment to collect these debts? Those golden eyes turned toward me, and I felt the weight of ancient regard, of a perspective that measured time in centuries rather than years. Because, Cinder said simply, we are few now, and diminishing. The city above grows ever larger, ever brighter, ever noisier, and the dark places where we can dwell shrink with each passing year. Your railways tunnel through our ancient chambers. Your sewers displace our waterways. Your electric lights penetrate spaces that have known only darkness since the world was made. We retreat further, deeper, into the last forgotten corners, and we know that eventually there will be nowhere left to retreat to. So we collect what is owed, we gather what we can, and we prepare for a time when we must leave entirely, when these islands will know us no more. The melancholy in its voice was unmistakable, and I felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this being and its kind, these remnants of an older Britain being slowly erased by progress and modernity, their very existence denied by the rational worldview that had come to dominate our age. Holmes, I could see, was similarly moved, his expression thoughtful, his usual analytical detachment softened by something approaching compassion. The footprints you leave, Holmes said after a moment. They are deliberate, a signature of sorts. A courtesy, Cinder replied, so that those with knowledge will understand what has occurred, so that the old families will remember, even if they choose not to believe, and so that investigators such as yourself will have evidence to follow, should they possess the wit to do so. I hoped you would come, Mr. Holmes. Your reputation suggests you are a man who can accept truth, even when it challenges comfortable assumptions. I wished to meet such a man, to explain, to be understood by at least one mind from the surface world before we vanish entirely. A sound from the passage, the one through which we had entered, not the one from which Cinder had emerged, made us all turn with sudden alertness. Footsteps, human footsteps, approaching with purpose, and with them the glow of lanterns that grew brighter as their bearers drew near. Holmes's expression shifted to one of concern, and Cinder tensed, its body coiling as though preparing for flight. The police, Holmes said quietly. Lestrade was most interested in this case, and I fear I may have been followed, or perhaps our absence from Baker Street raised questions. Cinder, they will not understand as I do. They will see only threat, only something to be captured or destroyed. You must go, return to your people, to safety. But Cinder did not move, instead standing very still, regarding the approaching lights, with an expression I could not read. No, it said softly. I am tired of hiding, tired of being dismissed as legend while we slowly disappear. Perhaps it is time for your world to see, to know, to choose what it will do with that knowledge. Perhaps some among you will care enough to remember, even if only in stories. That would be something. That would be a kind of immortality. The first of the police emerged into the chamber. 3 constables, led by Inspector Lestrade himself, his bulldog features showing surprise and then determination as he took in the scene before him. His eyes, fixed on Cinder, widened with shock, and his hand moved toward the truncheon at his belt. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice tight with tension, "step away from that creature. We've been searching these tunnels since we tracked you here, and I don't know what sort of horror you've uncovered, but we'll handle this according to law and—" "Stop," Holmes commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that made even Lestrade pause. "Inspector, I ask you to stay your hand and open your mind for just a moment. What you see before you is not a criminal, not a monster, but a being with as much right to existence as you or I, performing what it understands to be lawful collection of debts legitimately owed. The thefts you have been investigating are more complex than simple criminality, and they require not force, but understanding, not capture, but negotiation." Lestrade looked uncertain, his training and instincts warring with his respect for Holmes's judgment. And in that moment of hesitation, the chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which direction the future would take, toward understanding, or toward violence, toward preservation, or toward the final erasure of something ancient and irreplaceable. The lantern light flickered across ancient stone, casting shadows that danced and merged with the carved symbols on the chamber walls, and in that uncertain illumination I watched as civilizations, modern and ancient, surface and subterranean, stood poised on the edge of a moment that might reshape understanding or cement ignorance forever. Lestrade's hand remained near his truncheon, his constables arrayed behind him in a semicircle of official authority. Yet something in Holmes's commanding presence, in the very strangeness of the situation itself, held them in a state of suspended action, neither advancing nor retreating, simply observing with the wide-eyed wonder of children who have stumbled upon a fairy ring and know not whether to flee or to step inside. Cinder had not moved since the police arrived, standing with a stillness so complete it seemed almost sculptural, and I realized this was not the paralysis of fear, but rather the patience of something that had learned across centuries to wait, to observe, to choose its moments with careful deliberation. The golden eyes moved from face to face, assessing each constable, reading in their expressions the likelihood of violence or understanding, calculating odds in ways I could only imagine. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that seemed designed to diffuse tension through its very casualness. "You have known me for several years now. You have seen me solve cases that baffled the official force. You have learned, I hope, that appearances can deceive, and that truth often wears unexpected faces. I ask you now to trust my judgment for just a quarter hour. Allow me to explain what we have discovered here, and then make your decision based on understanding rather than instinct. Can you grant me that much?" Lestrade's face worked through several expressions: suspicion, uncertainty, professional pride, warring with pragmatic acknowledgement of Holmes's proven abilities. Finally, he nodded curtly, though his hand did not move from his belt. 15 minutes, Mr. Holmes, but I'm warning you, if that creature makes any threatening move, we'll act accordingly." "The creature has a name," Holmes said mildly, "Cinder, as it has told us, and it has been remarkably patient with our intrusion into what is, after all, a sacred space of considerable antiquity. But let me begin at the beginning, for the full story requires context that extends back centuries before any of us were born. What followed was a masterful recitation, Holmes laying out the evidence and reasoning with the clarity that made him unparalleled in his profession. The pattern of victims all descended from specific medieval families. The historical records of bargains made, the folkloric traditions that preserved memory of the hidden folk, the carved symbols that matched megalithic sites predating written history. He spoke of debt and obligation, of promises made and forgotten, of one world retreating as another advanced, of the tragedy inherent in the erasure of entire peoples who had inhabited these lands before our modern age imposed its rational order upon ancient mysteries. The constables listened with expressions ranging from skepticism to fascination, and I noticed that despite their training, despite their duty to maintain order and enforce law, they were being drawn into the narrative, beginning to see Cinder not as a threat to be subdued, but as a representative of something that demanded consideration, perhaps even respect. Lestrade's face remained stern, but his hand had dropped away from his truncheon, and he was listening with the attention of a man whose worldview was being gently but inexorably expanded. When Holmes finished, silence filled the chamber, save for the distant whisper of the fleet's waters, and that underlying hum from deeper passages that I now understood as the presence of other hidden folk, Cinder's people, waiting to see how this encounter would resolve. A full minute passed, marked by the slow drip of condensation from ceiling to floor, before Lestrade spoke. "This is the most irregular situation I've encountered in 20 years of police work," he said slowly, choosing his words with evident care. "If I write this up in an official report, they'll think I've lost my mind or taken to drink. But I can't deny what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And your explanation, Mr. Holmes, makes a kind of sense, however strange. The question is, what's to be done about it? Technically, thefts have occurred. Property has been taken. The law requires action." It was a remarkable statement, both a claim of sovereignty and an offer of peaceful coexistence, and I saw in Lestrade's face the struggle of a practical man confronting implications that extended far beyond his usual concerns of theft and violence. He looked to Holmes, seeking guidance, and my friend responded with a thoughtful expression. "Might I propose a solution?" Holmes said. "One that respects both the law Inspector Lestrade must uphold and the customs Cinder follows. The stolen items could be returned to their owners, thus satisfying the legal requirement. But in exchange, the families, once properly educated about their obligations, could provide offerings freely given, not taken, which would honor the spirit of the ancient bargains. Cinder and the hidden folk receive what they believe they are owed. The families maintain their property. The law is satisfied. And perhaps, most importantly, knowledge is preserved rather than lost. The existence of the hidden folk becomes a matter of record, protected rather than denied, remembered rather than forgotten." The suggestion hung in the air like the chamber's perpetual mist, and I could see minds working through implications. Cinder tilted its head, considering, and something like hope flickered across those alien features. Lestrade frowned, calculating how such an arrangement might be documented, whether his superiors would accept such an unorthodox resolution. "The families would need to agree," Lestrade said finally. "And there'd need to be some form of official recognition, some documentation that this wasn't simply me ignoring theft, out of superstitious fear or temporary insanity. The families will agree, Holmes said with confidence, once they understand the full situation. Mr. Blackwood, for instance, is a reasonable man who values historical truth. The others can be persuaded similarly. As for documentation, perhaps a private arrangement overseen by someone of unquestionable integrity, a solicitor perhaps, or a representative of the Crown who understands the value of preserving Britain's heritage in all its forms. Cinder moved toward the stone platform and carefully lifted the wooden box containing the collected items. I agree to these terms, it said formally, on behalf of the hidden folk of the fleet. We will return what we have taken, and we will accept offerings freely given. But more than this, we will share knowledge, as we did in the ancient times. There are tunnels beneath your city that even your engineers do not know, chambers of great age that hold secrets your historians would value. We will guide those who come with respect, who seek to learn rather than to exploit. This could be the beginning of a new bargain, a modern understanding built on ancient foundations. The constables had been shifting nervously throughout this exchange, clearly uncertain what to make of a situation so far outside their training, and one of them, young, barely 20, suddenly spoke up. "Begging your pardon, sirs, but my grandmother, she used to tell stories about the little folk who lived in the old places. Said her own grandmother knew people who'd seen them, who'd left offerings. We all thought it was just tales to frighten children, but standing here now, hearing this, it makes you think maybe the old ones knew things we've forgotten." His words seemed to shift something in the chamber's atmosphere, to introduce a note of possibility that transcended official duty and rational skepticism. Here was tradition reasserting itself, folklore claiming space beside fact, and in that moment I understood that what we were witnessing was not merely the resolution of a criminal case, but rather a small reopening of doors that modernity had firmly closed, a reminder that the world remained larger and stranger than our philosophies typically acknowledged. A sound from the passage through which we had entered, different from before, lighter, accompanied by a woman's voice calling out with worried urgency, announced another arrival. Miss Eleanor Blackwood emerged into the chamber's lantern light, her practical dress now muddied from the tunnels, her face flushed with exertion and determination. She stopped abruptly upon seeing the assembled company, her eyes widening as they found Cinder. But to her immense credit, she did not scream or flee, instead stepping forward with the same directness she had shown in her father's study. "Mr. Holmes," she said breathlessly, "I followed you from Baker Street. Forgive the intrusion, but I felt I must be here, must understand what truly happened to our manuscript. My father's health is fragile, and the loss has devastated him. If there is any chance of recovery, any explanation that might ease his mind." She trailed off as her gaze returned to Cinder, and now I saw not fear in her expression, but rather profound curiosity, the look of a scholar confronting primary source material of unparalleled significance. Holmes gestured her forward. "Miss Blackwood, allow me to introduce Cinder, keeper of bargains for the hidden folk of the fleet. You stand before the very subject of your family's ancient records, the reality behind centuries of carefully preserved tradition." Eleanor approached slowly, and Cinder regarded her with equal interest, those golden eyes seeming to read generations in her features. When they stood face to face, barely 3 feet apart, Cinder spoke with unexpected warmth. "You have the look of old Margaret Blackwood, who, in the year of your reckoning 1437, sang songs to my great-great-grandmother, and received in return knowledge of where silver ran through the London stone. Your family's prosperity began with those songs, with that knowledge, with the willingness to believe in what reason would later deny. I am pleased one of your blood has come to witness this moment, for it suggests memory persists even when buried beneath layers of forgetting." Eleanor's hand went to her throat, touching a small pendant there, a gesture I now recognized as instinctive rather than conscious, as though reaching for connection to ancestors whose beliefs she had studied without fully crediting. "The manuscript," she said softly. "It recorded such an exchange. I thought it merely poetic fancy, metaphorical rather than literal. But you are real. The bargains were real. Everything my family dismissed as folklore was history," Cinder completed. "Is history. Will continue to be history if we can reach accord this night. Your family's manuscript I will gladly return, along with the other items I have collected, if the families will honor the old agreements in new forms, appropriate to this modern age. Not from compulsion, but from understanding. Not from fear, but from choice. That is what I desire. That is what we all desire. To be remembered truthfully, to exist in your world's consciousness, not as monsters or myths, but as fellow inhabitants of these ancient islands, worthy of preservation and respect." The passion in those words moved something in the chamber's atmosphere, and I saw tears on Eleanor's cheeks, though whether from emotion or simply the damp air I could not say. She nodded, unable to speak, and in that moment an understanding passed between human and hidden folk that transcended the need for formal agreements, that spoke to something deeper than contract or obligation. Recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of kinship, however distant, however strange. Lestrade cleared his throat, bringing practical concerns back to the fore. "Right then. It seems we have the outline of an arrangement. Mr. Holmes, I'll want a full written account from you, details that can be filed confidentially for the record. Miss Blackwood, you'll speak to your father and the other families, explain the situation, obtain their cooperation, and, Cinder, is it? You'll facilitate the return of the items, and provide, I suppose, coordinates or information about these hidden passages you mentioned. Nothing in my training prepared me for negotiating with..." He paused, searching for appropriate terminology. "With representatives of alternative communities residing in jurisdictions of ambiguous legal status. But there's a first time for everything, I suppose. And if it keeps the peace and preserves something of value, then duty is served well enough." The practical Englishman asserting himself even in the face of impossible circumstances. It was so perfectly characteristic that I nearly laughed, though I controlled the impulse out of respect for the solemnity of the moment. Holmes was smiling, though, a small, satisfied expression that suggested he had hoped for precisely this outcome, had calculated that bringing all parties together would allow reason and mutual benefit to triumph over fear and incomprehension. "Then we are agreed," Holmes said. "The case of the Goblin thief of Fleet Street is resolved not through capture or punishment, but through understanding and accommodation. A new bargain for a new age, building upon the foundations of the old. I confess I find this outcome more satisfying than any conventional solution could have provided." Cinder bowed, a gesture of grace that seemed to acknowledge centuries of tradition. "Come," it said, "let me show you something before we conclude this night's work. Something that will help you understand what we preserve, what we remember, what we hope to pass forward, even as we ourselves fade from these lands." Cinder moved toward the deeper passage from which it had originally emerged, and without discussion, we found ourselves following. Holmes first, with his characteristic eagerness for knowledge. Eleanor Blackwood close behind, with the fervent attention of one whose worldview was being fundamentally reconstructed. Then myself and constructed. Then myself and Fletcher, with Lestrade and his constables bringing up the rear in a procession that would have seemed absurd had it not felt so profoundly significant. Our lanterns created a moving constellation of light through darkness, illuminating passages that narrowed and widened in irregular rhythm, sometimes requiring us to walk single file through gaps, barely wide enough for shoulders, sometimes opening into spaces where a dozen people might have stood comfortably. The stone beneath our feet grew older as we descended, the marks of human toolwork giving way to surfaces worn smooth by water and time, then to raw rock that predated any human presence in these lands. The air changed too, becoming somehow cleaner despite the depth, carrying mineral scents but also something else, a freshness that suggested circulation from sources unknown, as though the earth itself breathed through channels we could not see. The humming that had been merely background presence in the chamber grew stronger here, resolved into distinct voices, singing without words, in harmonies that seemed to bypass the ear entirely, and resonate directly in the chest, in the bones, creating a sensation, both unsettling and oddly comforting. "These passages," Cinder said over its shoulder, its voice carrying easily in the enclosed space, "were not made by my people, though we have used them for more generations than we can count. They are older still, natural formations enlarged by whatever forces shaped this land before the ice came, before the forests grew, when the world was younger and wilder, and the boundaries between different kinds of being were more fluid. We found them when we first came to these islands, following the rivers inland from the cold northern seas, seeking places where we might dwell without constant conflict with your kind, who even then were numerous and expanding. The passage opened suddenly into a cavern of such unexpected size that our lanterns could not find its far walls, creating instead an island of visibility in an ocean of darkness. But it was not empty darkness. As our eyes adjusted, we began to perceive other lights, small and bluish-green, scattered through the space like earthbound stars, numbering in the dozens. And as we stood frozen at the threshold, those lights began to move, to drift closer with curious purpose, revealing themselves to be carried by others of Cinder's kind, hidden folk emerging from whatever tasks or rest we had interrupted, drawn by the unprecedented presence of surface dwellers in their deepest sanctuary. Eleanor gasped softly, and I heard in that sound not fear but wonder, the exhalation of someone witnessing something they had dreamed of, but never truly believed possible. Even Lestrade seemed moved beyond his professional composure, his stern features softened by an expression approaching reverence. Holmes alone maintained his analytical demeanour, though I could see in the brightness of his eyes and the tense set of his shoulders that he too felt the profound significance of this moment. "My people," Cinder said simply, gesturing to the assembled hidden folk. "What remains of the Fleet clan, those who have chosen to persist in these depths, rather than retreat further north to the wild places where others of our kind have fled. We number now what two families numbered in the old days, when we were prosperous, and the bargains brought benefit to both peoples. The city above has cost us dearly, not through deliberate malice, but through simple expansion, through the inexorable growth that transforms all it touches, that leaves no space for those who prefer the margins, the forgotten places, the darkness where old things might continue their existence undisturbed. One of the smaller figures, a child, I realized, though its features held that same unsettling combination of familiar and alien that all the hidden folk shared, approached with hesitant curiosity, stopping a few feet from Eleanor and tilting its head in examination. It chittered softly, a sound not unlike birdsong, and Cinder responded in kind, a brief exchange in their own language that needed no translation to convey its meaning. Curiosity, permission granted, cautious welcome. The child extended one long-fingered hand toward Eleanor, who after a moment's hesitation reached out in return, and when their fingertips touched, both smiled, human and hidden folk sharing a moment of connection across the vast divide of difference. "Come," Cinder said, leading us deeper into the cavern. "Let me show you what we preserve, what gives meaning to our continued existence here beneath your railways and sewers and electric lights." We followed across uneven stone floor, our boots splashing occasionally through shallow pools of water that reflected our lamplight in shattered fragments. The other hidden folk parted to allow us passage, their luminous eyes following our progress with expressions I could not read, neither hostile nor particularly welcoming, simply observant, reserving judgment, waiting to see what would come of this unprecedented intrusion into their world. At the cavern's far end, set into the living rock, was a wall of carved stone that took my breath away with its intricacy and obvious antiquity. The symbols we had seen in the chamber above were here reproduced in vast profusion, covering every inch of surface in what appeared to be a historical record of staggering scope. Cinder's light played across the carvings, and even my untrained eye could perceive that they were organized in registers, in horizontal bands that read from bottom to top, the lowest deeply weathered and ancient, the highest relatively fresh and clear. "This is our memory," Cinder explained, its voice carrying a quiet pride. "Each generation adds its layer, recording the significant events, the changes witnessed, the knowledge accumulated. The lowest sections were carved when glaciers still covered the north, when great beasts walked the land, when your kind were few and scattered. The middle sections record the coming of the stone circles, the arrival of metal workers, the establishment of the first permanent settlements. The upper sections document the rise of cities, the spread of new religions, the transformation of the wild places into cultivated fields and paved roads. And the most recent additions chronicle our own diminishment, our retreat, our adaptation to a world that has less and less space for what we represent." Holmes had moved close to the wall, his glass out, examining the carvings with absorbed attention. "This is priceless," he murmured. "A historical record from a perspective entirely outside conventional documentation. The insights this could provide into Britain's pre-Roman history, into climate changes, into the development of human civilization from the viewpoint of observers who watched it unfold. It would revolutionize our understanding of the past. Which is why," Cinder said carefully, "it must remain secret, or at least known only to a very few who can be trusted to preserve rather than exploit, to respect rather than appropriate. Your museums would take these stones, would display them with little plaques explaining in confident terms what they meant, never acknowledging that they cannot truly read them, cannot fully comprehend the perspective they represent. Better they remain here in the darkness where they were created, accessible to scholars who approach with humility and genuine desire to understand rather than merely to possess. It was a pointed comment, directed at the larger question of how surface world and underworld might coexist, and it hung in the humid air while we absorbed its implications. A piece of stone fell somewhere in the cavern's darkness, its impact echoing through the space with sharp clarity, before fading into the general whisper of water and breath, and that omnipresent humming. Eleanor spoke, her voice thoughtful. Might I be permitted to study these carvings? Not to publish widely, not to claim any credit or draw attention, but simply to learn, to understand, to carry that knowledge forward in ways that honor its source. I have spent years studying my family's manuscript, attempting to decode the annotations, and I confess the opportunity to learn directly from those who created the knowledge. It would be the fulfillment of every scholarly dream I have ever harbored. Cinder regarded her with those golden eyes, and something passed between them, perhaps recognition of shared passion, perhaps acknowledgement of her genuine respect, perhaps simply the understanding that here was someone who might serve as bridge between worlds, carrying understanding in both directions. Yes, Cinder said at last, you may study, may learn, may carry knowledge forward, but carefully, selectively, ensuring that what you share serves to preserve rather than endanger. We have survived thus far through obscurity and discretion. We do not seek fame or recognition, merely the right to continue our existence in peace, to maintain our traditions, to pass our memory to whatever future awaits. Lestrade had been quietly conferring with his constables, and now he stepped forward with the air of a man who had reached a decision. I've seen enough, he said simply. Whatever official report I file will note that the thefts have been resolved through recovery of property and mutual agreement between parties. The details, the location of this place, the nature of its inhabitants, those will remain unrecorded, known only to those of us present. I have no desire to see this cavern become a destination for gawkers and scientists who lack appropriate respect, and I suspect my superiors would prefer not to confront questions about jurisdiction over populations they cannot acknowledge without appearing mad. It was perhaps the most pragmatic response possible, and I felt a surge of respect for Lestrade, whose devotion to duty was strong enough to override the natural human impulse to publicize the extraordinary, to share the impossible discovery. Holmes nodded approvingly, clearly having anticipated precisely this reaction. Then we have our accord, Holmes said. The items will be returned. The families will provide appropriate offerings through Miss Blackwood's mediation. Inspector Lestrade will file a suitably vague official report, and those of us present will maintain discretion about this place and its inhabitants. In exchange, the hidden folk will share knowledge with select scholars, will provide guidance to those who seek understanding of London's hidden geography, and will continue their existence secure in the knowledge that at least some among the surface world acknowledge their right to persist. Cinder moved to the center of our small group, its elongated frame somehow seeming larger in the cavern's vastness, and it raised one 6-fingered hand in a gesture that might have been benediction or simply acknowledgement. "It is agreed," it said formally, "a new bargain for a new age, built upon the foundations of old agreements, but adapted to changed circumstances. May it prove more enduring than the promises our peoples have made before, and may it serve both communities well in the years to come." The other hidden folk had drawn closer during this exchange, forming a loose circle around us, and now they began to hum in unison, a sound that built from whisper to resonant chord that seemed to vibrate the very stone beneath our feet. It was their way, I understood, of solemnizing the agreement, of marking it as significant in whatever manner they marked such things. We stood within that circle of sound and light, human and hidden folk together, and for a moment the boundaries between our worlds seemed less fixed, less impermeable. As though given proper care and mutual respect, coexistence might truly be possible. When the humming faded, Cinder gestured back toward the passage through which we had come. "I will guide you to the surface now, and tomorrow the items will be returned to their owners through whatever channel Miss Blackwood arranges. But remember this place, remember this night, and remember that beneath the London you know, another London persists, older, stranger, but no less real for all its strangeness. We will be here, in the forgotten spaces, maintaining our vigil, preserving our memory, waiting to see what the future holds for both our peoples." The return journey through the passages seemed shorter somehow, or perhaps we were simply too absorbed in our own thoughts to mark the distance carefully. We emerged at last into the Fleet culvert where Fletcher had first led us, and the familiar Victorian brickwork seemed almost comforting after the ancient stone of deeper chambers. Cinder accompanied us to the iron grating, helped us through, then paused at the threshold between underground and surface world. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," it said softly, "for understanding, for listening, for helping to forge this new arrangement. You have done a great service this night, not merely to my people, but to the cause of knowledge itself, for you have demonstrated that reason and wonder need not be enemies, that the scientific mind can accommodate mystery without diminishing either." Holmes bowed slightly. "The service was mutual, Cinder. You have reminded me that the world holds depths I had not fully acknowledged, and that certainty can sometimes be the enemy of truth. I am grateful for the lesson, and I hope our paths cross again in more pleasant circumstances." Cinder nodded, then turned and descended back into the darkness, its light dwindling until it disappeared entirely, leaving us standing in the foggy London night with nothing but memory and changed understanding to prove the past hours had been real rather than some collective fever dream. The fog had thickened during our hours below ground, transforming London into a place of muted sounds and obscured distances, sea of muted sounds and obscured distances, where gas lamps became dim halos suspended in grey nothing, and the familiar streets acquired the quality of dreamscape, half-remembered and uncertain. We stood for a moment on the wet cobblestones near the warehouse wall, breathing air that seemed impossibly fresh after the depths we had traversed, feeling the cool moisture settle on our faces and hands, like a gentle blessing from the ordinary world, welcoming us back to its mundane embrace. Lestrade dismissed his constables with quiet instructions about discretion and official silence, and they dispersed into the fog with backward glances that suggested they were still processing what they had witnessed, still attempting to reconcile ancient impossibility with modern certainty. Fletcher was the first to break our contemplative silence, his weathered face creased in an expression of profound satisfaction mixed with vindication. "Well then," he said, his rough voice carrying a note of wonder, "I've worked London's underground for 30 years, heard all manner of stories from old-timers who claimed to have seen things down there that couldn't be explained. Always half believed, half doubted. You know how it is. But now I've seen with my own eyes, shaken hands with legend itself, and I'll tell you true, the world's a bigger, stranger place than most folk credit. And that's a comfort somehow, knowing there's still mysteries left, still corners that haven't been mapped and measured and stripped of their peculiarity." Holmes placed a hand on the Tosha's shoulder with genuine warmth. "You have my thanks, Fletcher, for guiding us into those depths with both expertise and open mind. Few men would have accepted what we encountered with such grace. I shall ensure you are compensated for your time, and I hope you will consider yourself available should we need to venture below again, for I suspect Miss Blackwood's studies will require occasional access to those passages, properly supervised and respectful of the inhabitants." We secured 2 cabs, Lestrade taking one back to Scotland Yard with promises to prepare the necessary documentation, while Holmes, Eleanor, Fletcher and myself crowded into the second for the journey back toward more familiar territory. The fog made progress slow, our horse picking its way carefully through streets barely visible beyond its own nose, the driver cursing softly but without real heat, accepting the weather's vagaries with the patience of one who had navigated worse. Inside the cab, we sat in companionable silence, each absorbed in private reflection on the night's extraordinary events. Eleanor Blackwood sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant but peaceful, as though she had achieved some long-sought answer to questions that had troubled her for years. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost meditative. "My father used to tell me that the manuscript was more than historical curiosity, that it represented connection to something authentic and important that most of the modern world had dismissed. I thought it was merely sentiment, the fondness of an old man for family tradition. But he was right, Mr. Holmes. It was connection, and breaking that connection cost us something we did not even realize we had lost until it was reclaimed tonight. I wonder how many other families carry similar burdens of broken promises. How many other debts accumulate in darkness while we congratulate ourselves on our enlightened modernity? Many, I suspect, Holmes replied quietly. Britain's history is layered with such obligations, such promises made and forgotten as the world changed around them. The hidden folk of the fleet are perhaps unique in their persistence, in their refusal to simply fade away quietly. But the pattern is universal. Old agreements dismissed as superstition, old relationships severed in the name of progress, old knowledge discarded because it does not fit contemporary frameworks. Your work documenting these connections, sharing them carefully with those who can appreciate their significance, that may prove more valuable than you yet realize. Baker Street welcomed us with its familiar comforts. The warm light in our windows, visible even through fog. Mrs. Hudson's industrious presence, evident in the smell of fresh coffee and baking that wafted from the lower floor despite the late hour. She met us at the door with barely suppressed curiosity, taking in our muddy boots and dishevelled appearance with the forbearance of one long accustomed to Holmes's irregular activities, and within moments had hustled Eleanor off to freshen up, while insisting that coffee and sandwiches would appear shortly whether we desired them or not. Fletcher declined to stay, citing early work in the morning and a desire to process the night's events in solitude. But he accepted Holmes's payment with dignity and departed with a promise to remain available should future expeditions require his guidance. Holmes and I retired to our sitting room, where the fire burned low but welcoming, and we collapsed into our respective chairs with the profound relief of men who had survived considerable adventure and required nothing more than rest and reflection. The coffee arrived as promised, accompanied by sandwiches of cold beef and horseradish that tasted remarkably fine given our hunger, and Mrs. Hudson's knowing glance suggested she had deduced more than we might wish about our evening's activities, but would maintain discretion out of long-standing loyalty. Eleanor joined us shortly, her hair tidied and her dress brushed free of tunnel dust, though her eyes still held that faraway quality of one whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally restructured. Holmes nodded approvingly. A sound strategy. I suggest we arrange a gathering, perhaps here at Baker Street, where those who went below can provide testimony, where Inspector Lestrade can explain the official position, and where you can present the proposal for renewed offerings in terms that emphasize mutual benefit rather than obligation born of fear. The families must choose freely to participate, understanding both the historical context and the contemporary reality. Coercion will serve neither side well. We talked long into the night, or rather into the early morning, for the clock on the mantel had passed 3 before we finally exhausted the immediate practical considerations and moved into more philosophical territory. Holmes spoke thoughtfully about the nature of evidence and belief, about how scientific rationalism, for all its considerable benefits, had perhaps been too quick to dismiss phenomena that did not fit its frameworks, had constructed a worldview that left no space for the genuinely anomalous or the persistently inexplicable. I have built my reputation on reason, on deduction, on the firm belief that all mysteries ultimately yield to logical analysis, he said, staring into the dying fire. And yet, tonight, I have encountered beings whose very existence challenges the comfortable certainty I have maintained about the world's fundamental nature. They are not supernatural. Clearly, they are as natural as you or I, subject to physical laws, requiring sustenance and shelter, possessing language and culture and memory. But they are other, Watson, profoundly other, and their existence suggests that the natural world is more capacious, more accommodating of variety than our scientific taxonomies acknowledge. It is humbling and exhilarating in equal measure. Eleanor listened with the intentness of one who recognized a kindred spirit, someone else whose worldview had been expanded rather than shattered by the night's revelations. Perhaps, she offered, the distinction we draw between natural and supernatural is itself flawed. Perhaps there is only the known and the not yet known, the observed and the not yet observed. The hidden folk were always natural, always part of Britain's ecology in the broadest sense. We simply lost the ability or willingness to perceive them, chose to classify their existence as impossible, and therefore ceased to look for evidence of it. We blinded ourselves through certainty rather than being blinded by ignorance. It was a profound observation, and we sat with it in silence while the fire collapsed into embers and the first hints of dawn began to dilute the darkness beyond our windows. London was stirring the earliest workers beginning their day, bakers firing their ovens, milk wagons clattering through streets still shrouded in fog, the great city emerging once more into consciousness with all its complexity and contradiction intact. The following days passed in a flurry of careful activity. The stolen items were indeed returned, appearing mysteriously in their owners' homes during the night, placed with such care and discretion that some initially believed they had simply overlooked them before. Eleanor worked tirelessly to contact each family, to arrange private meetings where the situation could be explained without sensationalism or public exposure. Holmes and I attended several of these gatherings, providing corroborating testimony and answering questions with as much honesty as circumstances permitted. The reactions varied predictably. Some families received the information with immediate acceptance, relieved to have explanation for phenomena they had privately wondered about. Others required more convincing, demanded evidence, expressed skepticism that gradually eroded as details accumulated and witnesses multiplied. A few, notably the Mortimers, initially rejected the entire affair as elaborate hoax and required a personal visit from Cinder itself, arranged with considerable negotiation and conducted with maximum discretion, before they could accept the reality of their ancestral obligations. But within a fortnight, agreement had been reached. Each family would provide yearly offerings, not of great monetary value, but of symbolic significance. Items crafted with care and attention, foods prepared according to old recipes, songs preserved from earlier generations. These would be left at designated locations, known only to the families and the hidden folk, collected quietly and received with gratitude. In exchange, the families received assurance that no further reclamations would be necessary, and selected family members, primarily Eleanor, but others as well, were granted permission to visit the deeper chambers for purposes of study and cultural exchange. Inspector Lestrade proved as good as his word, filing a report so deliberately vague and bureaucratic that it satisfied official requirements, while revealing nothing of substance about the case's true resolution. The newspapers, denied sensational details, gradually lost interest and moved on to other stories. The Goblin thief of Fleet Street became merely another unsolved London mystery, occasionally referenced but never fully explained, fading into that comfortable category of urban legend that the city collected like other cities collected architectural styles. Holmes himself seemed changed by the experience, though the alteration was subtle, visible mainly in moments of quiet reflection, when his gaze would drift toward the window, and his expression would soften, with what might have been wonder or perhaps simple acknowledgement that his understanding of the world's possibilities had been permanently expanded. He continued his detective work with undiminished skill, but I noticed he was more willing to entertain hypotheses that stretched beyond conventional explanation, more open to the possibility that not everything mysterious required, or could receive, complete rational explication. On a grey afternoon, some 3 weeks after our subterranean adventure, Eleanor Blackwood called at Baker Street with news and a request. She had been below twice more, guided by Cinder through passages that revealed layers of London's history invisible to conventional archaeology. She had sketched symbols, recorded oral histories, begun compiling what would eventually become a private scholarly work, documenting the hidden folk's perspective on Britain's past. But today she carried something different, a small wooden box, beautifully carved, which she placed upon Holmes's desk with evident reverence. "This is from Cinder," she explained, "with gratitude for your role in forging the new bargain. Inside, you will find something that may prove useful in future investigations. Should you encounter other mysteries that touch upon the boundaries between known and unknown, they said you would understand its purpose when the time came." Holmes opened the box carefully, revealing a small crystal of unusual clarity resting upon velvet cloth, and beside it a folded paper bearing symbols we now recognized as hidden folk writing. Holmes studied both items with absorbed attention, then looked up with that particular smile that indicated he had received a gift whose full significance he appreciated, even if he could not yet articulate it completely. "Please convey my thanks," he said simply, "and my hope that this is merely the beginning of a long and mutually beneficial association. Tell Cinder that should they ever require assistance from the surface world, they need only send word, and I shall respond with all the resources at my disposal." Eleanor departed with promises to maintain regular communication, and Holmes placed the crystal carefully in a drawer of his desk, filing it away against some future need we could not yet imagine, but which he apparently trusted would eventually manifest. Winter had settled over London with unusual gentleness that year, transforming the city not through harsh frost or heavy snow, but through soft mists that rose from the Thames each evening, and lingered until each evening, and lingered until mid-morning, creating a world of softened edges and muted colours that seemed almost dreamlike in its tranquility. From the windows of Baker Street, I watched the season's progression with a contemplative pleasure I had not known before our underground adventure, finding myself more attuned to the subtle rhythms of the natural world, even here in the heart of urban civilization, more aware of how the old earth persisted beneath the modern city's bustling surface, patient and eternal, and holding secrets that most would never suspect. Eleanor Blackwood had become a regular visitor to Baker Street, arriving every fortnight or so with reports from her ongoing studies in the passages below, her notebooks filling with sketches and observations that documented a culture and history invisible to conventional scholarship. She spoke of progress in deciphering the symbolic language carved on the ancient walls, of oral histories shared during her visits that illuminated centuries of parallel existence between surface and subterranean peoples, of gradual trust building between herself and the hidden folk community. The other families, too, had maintained their part of the bargain, leaving offerings at designated locations and finding them gratefully received. The old connections re-established in forms appropriate to modern circumstances. This particular evening found Holmes and myself alone in our sitting room, the fire casting its warm glow across familiar furnishings, while outside the winter mist pressed against the windows like something alive and gently curious. Mrs. Hudson had retired early, leaving us with tea and biscuits and the comfortable silence of long companionship. Holmes sat with a book open on his lap, a volume on pre-Roman Britain he had acquired shortly after our adventure, though I suspected he was not actually reading, his gaze too distant, too abstracted, suggesting thoughts that ranged far beyond the printed page. A soft scratching at the window made us both turn with sudden attention. There, upon the sill, barely visible through the mist, crouched a small figure that could only be one of the hidden folk, its golden eyes reflecting our lamplight, one elongated hand raised in what might have been greeting or request for entry. Holmes moved immediately to the window and opened it, admitting a rush of cool, damp air and our unexpected visitor, who slipped inside with fluid grace and bowed formally. It was not Cinder, but a younger individual, smaller and more delicate in build, carrying a leather satchel that it handled with evident care. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," it said in accented but clear English. "Forgive the intrusion at this late hour. I am called Ember, apprentice to Cinder in the keeping of bargains, and I bring messages and a gift from my people to yours. May I present them, or do I come at an inconvenient time?" Holmes gestured graciously to a chair near the fire. "You are most welcome, Ember. Please, warm yourself, and share whatever news you bring. We are always pleased to receive word from our friends below." Ember settled into the offered chair with obvious pleasure, extending its hands toward the fire's warmth. And for a moment, we simply sat together in companionable quiet, three beings from different worlds, finding common ground in the universal comfort of heat and light against winter's chill. The teacup on the side table trembled slightly as a heavy dray passed in the street below, its wheels rumbling across cobblestones, and the sound seemed to remind Ember of its purpose. "Cinder sends greetings and news," Ember began, its voice taking on the formal cadence of one delivering rehearsed messages. "The bargain holds strong, the families honor their obligations, and relations between our peoples improve with each passing season. The tensions that drove the reclamations have eased, and we feel more secure in our continued existence beneath your city than we have for many generations. For this," Cinder says, "you bear substantial credit, Mr. Holmes, and the hidden folk wish to express their gratitude in tangible form." From the satchel, Ember withdrew a journal bound in leather of extraordinary suppleness, its pages handmade from some material I could not identify, and upon its cover, symbols identical to those we had seen carved in the ancient chamber. "This," Ember explained, presenting it to Holmes with both hands in a gesture of formal gifting, "is a blank book prepared according to our traditional methods, its pages treated to resist decay for centuries. Cinder suggests you might use it to record your most significant investigations, those cases that touch upon mysteries deeper than mere criminality. Those moments when the boundaries between known and unknown reveal themselves to be more permeable than comfortable certainty prefers. It is our hope that in some future age, when our peoples perhaps understand each other better still, this record might serve as bridge, as testament to the possibility of cooperation across profound difference." Holmes accepted the journal with visible emotion, his long fingers tracing the symbols on its cover with gentle reverence. "Please convey to Cinder and all your people my deep gratitude. This is a gift of extraordinary significance, and I shall use it as suggested, to document not merely facts, but also implications, not merely solutions, but also the questions that persist even after solutions are found. The case that brought us together will of course be its first entry, preserved as reminder of the night when reason and wonder discovered they need not be enemies." Ember nodded, clearly pleased by Holmes's response, then produced a second, smaller item from the satchel, a sealed envelope bearing no address but marked with symbols we now recognized. "This," Ember said, "is for Miss Eleanor Blackwood, to be delivered at your convenience. It contains invitation to witness a ceremony of considerable importance to my people, one performed only once in each generation, and Cinder believes her scholarly interest would be well served by attendance. The details are within, along with instructions for safe passage to the location. We shall ensure she receives it promptly, I assured our visitor, accepting the envelope and placing it carefully on the mantelpiece where it would not be forgotten. Ember rose to leave, clearly conscious of propriety and not wishing to overstay welcome despite our genuine pleasure in the company. Holmes accompanied our guest to the window, but before Ember could depart, a question that had been forming in my mind throughout the visit finally found voice. "Ember," I said, "might I ask, do your people believe this bargain will hold? That the peace we have forged will prove lasting? Or do you fear that human nature, human expansion, will eventually force another crisis?" The young hidden folk turned those luminous eyes upon me, and I saw in them a mixture of hope and resignation, of wisdom hard-won and carefully maintained. "We believe," Ember said slowly, choosing words with evident care, "that nothing in this world is permanent save change itself. The bargain will hold for a time, perhaps a long time if we are fortunate, but eventually the world will shift again, will transform in ways we cannot predict, and new accommodations will be necessary. What matters is not permanence, but rather the willingness to adapt, to communicate, to seek understanding, even when easy answers fail. You humans have shown us that some among you possess this willingness, and that gives us hope sufficient to continue, to persist, to believe that our future might hold more than mere survival." Holmes closed the window gently and returned to his chair, the journal resting on his lap, his fingers idly tracing its cover, while his thoughts clearly ranged far beyond our comfortable room. "Watson," he said at length, his voice soft and contemplative, "I have spent my adult life in pursuit of certainty, constructing explanations that leave no room for doubt, reducing complex human behavior to comprehensible patterns and motives. It has been satisfying work, intellectually stimulating, socially valuable. But tonight, I find myself wondering if perhaps I have been solving the wrong class of problems, or rather, attending only to one category of mystery while ignoring others equally worthy of investigation." I waited, knowing Holmes well enough to recognize when he was working towards some significant articulation, when his thoughts needed space to develop without interruption. The fire settled in its grate with a soft whisper of falling ash, and somewhere in the building, Mrs. Hudson's cat knocked something over with a distant clatter. But these ordinary sounds seemed only to deepen the evening's reflective quality. "The hidden folk," Holmes continued, "represent mysteries that cannot be fully solved, cannot be reduced to comfortable explanation, and filed away as concluded cases. They simply are, existing at angles to our understanding, their presence requiring not solution, but rather acceptance, not explanation, but rather acknowledgement. And I find, somewhat to my surprise, that this is satisfying in its own way, perhaps more deeply satisfying than the neat resolutions I typically seek. There is profound peace in accepting that the world holds wonders I will never fully comprehend, that my role is not to explain everything, but rather to facilitate understanding where possible, and maintain respectful curiosity where understanding fails. It was the most philosophical I had heard Holmes speak in years, and I recognized in his words the working through of insights gained from our extraordinary adventure. We sat together as the evening deepened toward night, occasionally adding observations or memories from that remarkable expedition beneath the city, but mostly simply being present with each other and with our expanded awareness of the world's true scope and strangeness. The clock struck midnight with its familiar chime, and as though the sound released us from contemplation back into ordinary time, we stirred and began the small rituals of preparing for bed. Holmes carefully placed the journal in his desk, positioning it where he would see it first thing each morning, as reminder and inspiration. Eleanor's letter found secure placement in the drawer where we kept correspondence requiring prompt attention. And as we moved toward our respective chambers, I felt a contentment I had not known in some time, a sense that life had revealed depths previously unsuspected, and that the revelation had enriched rather than troubled, had opened possibilities rather than closing certainties. I pause here, dear listener, to hope that this tale has served its purpose, has carried you gently through these hours toward the peaceful shores of sleep. If you have found comfort in this story, if the mystery of the goblin thief and the wonder of the hidden folk have occupied your thoughts in ways that eased the day's tensions and prepared you for rest, then perhaps you might consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like to help others find these stories, and sharing in the comments what brought you here tonight, what you carry with you from this tale. Your presence in this quiet space is valued. Your company through these narrative hours is appreciated. And I hope you will return for other journeys through London's mysteries and marvels. And now, as the story concludes and sleep beckons with gentle insistence, let me wish you the deepest and most restorative rest. May your dreams be peaceful. May your sleep be untroubled. May you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying with you perhaps some small reminder that the world remains larger and stranger and more wonderful than our daily concerns typically acknowledge. There are mysteries beneath every city, wonders in every forgotten corner, and sometimes, just sometimes, when we approach with open minds and respectful hearts, those mysteries reveal themselves not as threats to be solved, but as invitations to deeper understanding, to expanded awareness, to the recognition that we share this ancient earth with more than we typically credit. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep deeply and peacefully, knowing that somewhere beneath the streets you walk, other lives continue their quiet existence. Other stories unfold in darkness, and the old earth remembers everything, holds everything, contains multitudes beyond imagining. The gas lamps glow in Baker Street windows. The fire burns low in familiar grates, and London settles into its winter dreams while you too drift toward your own peaceful rest. Good night, good night. And may the mysteries of the world bring you wonder rather than worry, peace rather than disturbance, and always, always the gentle comfort of stories told in the darkness, carrying you softly toward sleep's welcoming embrace.